Hello, so this is going to be a little bit of a different video. As you can see, I have a couple of stacks of books beside me. I am going to talk about my favorite author, Hugh MacLennan. Hugh MacLennan was born in Nova Scotia in 1907, and he died in 1990, I believe. He was a 5-time Governor General's Award winner, which for many of my viewers who are American, that is one of the most prestigious literary awards in Canada. And he was also an English professor at McGill University in Montreal, Quebec. So, I'm going to start by showing you my McGill Queen's University Press editions. Not all of his novels have been released in that edition, but those are the most recent editions. And then I'm going to show you my first editions and then my paperbacks. So these are my McGill University Press editions. The first one here is The Precipice. This book looks at American-Canadian relations. It's about a young woman by the name of Lucy Cameron, and she lives in a small Ontario town in the 1930s and 40s. And she marries an American man and moves to the United States. It's about culture shock, really, trying to reconcile her small town Ontario Puritan upbringing with the capitalist New York City. And it actually has quite a negative reflection and portrayal of the United States. Next is Voices in Time by Hugh MacLennan. This was published in 1980. It's his last novel. It's kind of a dystopian, yeah, I would call it dystopian. It's set in approximately 2030, and it's told from the perspective mainly of an old man who remembers what things used to be like. The reader is made to understand that there's been some sort of event that has brought down Western civilization as we know it, and the narrator traces everything back and remembers the October crisis of 1970. It's not considered his best novel, but it's not his worst novel either. Next, we have Return of the Sphinx. This novel was published in 1967, and it looks at the tension between French and English Canada in the 60s. Specifically, it looks at the tension in a specific family. It also heavily plays on the intellectual culture of Quebec in the 1960s. I really love the first line of this novel. It's related to the land. A lot of Canadian literature, early Canadian literature and modernist Canadian literature focuses on the land. So it begins, the land defied everyone's idea of what a land ought to be. Just the land by being where it was, what it was, and how it was. I just find that really beautiful. And the next one is The Watch That Ends the Night. This was published in 1959. I think it was 59, either that or 56. 58. 1958. So this novel is set in Montreal, and it looks at French-Canadian Montreal intellectual culture in the 1930s, and it deals a lot with the communist witch hunts that were taking place. But it also, it's a romance. Basically, the premise is this woman, Catherine, 15 or 20 years beforehand, her husband went off to war, never came back. She believes he's dead. At the beginning of the novel, he returns. The problem is she's married someone else. She has a heart condition, which contributes to the title of the novel. The Watch That Ends the Night is basically a death watch. So those are the McGill Queen's University Press paperbacks. Then I also have hardcover editions. Many of them are first editions. This is a first edition of Return of the Sphinx. Cover is very 60s. It's actually signed. Someone by the name of Joanne had MacLennan sign it in '73. I also have The Watch That Ends the Night in a first edition. There's MacLennan on the back, very youthful. And I have a first edition of Two Solitudes from 1945. The dust jacket is very battered. There's the youthful author. And interestingly, this one's kind of fun. I have the Cole's Notes for Two Solitudes. Then also in hardcover, I have a copy of Scotsman's Return and Other Essays. This is a collection of kind of eclectic pieces by MacLennan. There's 29 titles in total in here. The titles range from everything to My Last Colonel, Oxford Revisited, Montrealer, Remembrance Day 2010 AD, Confessions of a Woodchopping Man, and Boy Meets Girl in Winnipeg, and Who Cares? Literature in a New Country, and of course, Scotsman's Return. This was published in 1960. And then I also have a first edition of The Precipice. I really love the cover on this one. This green small town. And once again, there's MacLennan on the back. So those are my first editions. Then I also have a collection of the vintage paperbacks. First up is my very first copy of Two Solitudes that I ever owned. I bought this when I was in high school for an independent English assignment, and that is how I discovered MacLennan. So this is from the 60s, I believe. Doesn't actually say, but I'm going to assume it was published in the 60s. This is a Popular Library edition. Then I have this Laurentian Library edition of Two Solitudes. It has this kind of psychedelic cover. This one, I don't think it was ever read because the binding is very tight. This one is from 1967. I have another copy of Two Solitudes. This is a Macmillan paperback. It matches an edition of Return of the Sphinx and an edition of The Watch That Ends the Night that I also have. Then I have this Signet edition of The Watch That Ends the Night. It's got a cover that reminds me a bit of Harlequin Romance or some of the vintage editions of Gone with the Wind. The Passions and Politics of a Generation That Was Young in the 30s. New York Times, one of the finest novels in many months. This is actually an American edition. Back in the day, most of MacLennan's novels were also published for the American market. This one is from 1961. And then I have a New Canadian Library edition of Barometer Rising. Two Solitudes is also available in this edition, and I bought the novel 3 times for friends, but I've yet to buy myself Two Solitudes in this edition. Then I also have a second New Canadian Library edition of Barometer Rising. This is one of the vintage paperbacks published in the 60s and 70s. The New Canadian Library editions from the 60s and 70s are these brightly colored, really beautiful paperbacks. And I have an even older New Canadian So just briefly, edition. Barometer Rising is about the Halifax explosion of 1917. I believe at the time it was the largest man-made explosion to date. Basically what happened, two ships, one of them loaded down with ammunition, collided in Halifax's harbor and exploded and took out a large chunk of the city. That was really the only way that World War I came to Canadian soil. I just realized I didn't tell you about Two Solitudes, but if you want to hear about Two Solitudes, I'll put a link to a video I did 6 months ago or so in the description of this video, specifically about Two Solitudes. And then finally, I have a New Canadian Library edition of Each Man's Son. This is my least favorite MacLennan book. I have a Laurentian Library edition of it as well. So this is my collection of Hugh MacLennan books. I hope you'll check them out at some point. Whether you're Canadian or not, his novels are truly fantastic.